The apple is the most recognized fruit on the planet. We place it in the hands of Adam and Eve, teachers keep one on their desks as a universal symbol of knowledge, and the biggest tech company in the world uses it as their logo. When we think of untouched, wholesome nature, we picture an apple. But almost everything we associate with its history is based on a linguistic fluke. In the 4th century, a scholar named Jerome translated the Hebrew Bible into Latin and used the word malum, a term that happens to mean both evil and apple. Centuries later, Renaissance painters looking for a visual shorthand for temptation seized on this Latin pun. They populated their canvases with apples, effectively fusing the fruit to the story of the fall through sheer artistic repetition. The reality of the apple in your grocery store is far more clinical. When you buy a perfect, shiny fruit in March, it was likely harvested the previous September. It has been sitting in a massive refrigerated warehouse for up to 10 months, coated in a thin layer of food-grade wax, breathing just enough in a low-oxygen, controlled atmosphere room to stay alive. Biologically, it gets stranger. If you eat that grocery store apple, save its seeds, and plant them in your backyard, the tray that grows will have almost no physical resemblance to the fruit you just ate. The modern apple is a high-tech artifact, a product of specialized storage science, genetic cloning, and decades of aggressive corporate rebranding. The true ancestor of every apple on Earth grows in a mountain range most people have never heard of. In the Tian Shan Mountains along the border between China and Kazakhstan, apples grow wild in dense, tangled forests, producing fruit in every size, shape, and color imaginable. These wild forests highlight the apple's core biological quirk: extreme genetic unpredictability. Apples do not grow true from seed. If you plant a seed from a sweet Granny Smith, you are essentially rolling the dice on its genetics. The resulting tree will almost certainly produce something small, bitter, and unpleasant to eat. To bypass this evolutionary chaos, the Romans perfected a technique called grafting 2,000 years ago. Instead of planting seeds, you cut a branch from a tree you like, cut a notch into the rootstock of another tree, and bind them together until the tissues fuse and grow as one plant. Because of grafting, every single Gala, Fuji, and Honeycrisp apple in every grocery store is genetically identical to every other apple of its kind. Entire orchards stretching across Washington state are literal clone armies, copied millions of times from a single original tree that might have sprouted centuries ago. Humanity realized early on that the only way to commercialize this wild mountain fruit was to bypass its natural reproduction entirely, turning an unpredictable organism into a static copy-and-paste commodity. Which brings us to 19th century America and a man named John Chapman. You probably know him as Johnny Appleseed. Chapman did walk the frontier in ragged clothes planting nurseries, but he planted seeds, not grafted branches. The trees he grew produced tart, highly acidic fruit commonly called spitters, named for what you did if you tried to bite into one. These apples were useless for snacking. Chapman grew them for one highly lucrative purpose: hard cider. In frontier America, drinking water was often contaminated with bacteria. Fermented cider was safe, and settlers consumed an estimated 10.5 ounces of it per day. By the late 1800s, the temperance movement began gaining immense political power. Groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union looked at America's staggering alcohol consumption and correctly identified apple orchards as the source of the problem. Prohibition was on the horizon, and the apple industry was entirely dependent on booze. The government targeted the supply directly. Federal agents and local enforcers arrived on farms with axes and saws, physically chopping down multi-generational apple orchards to erase the nation's primary source of alcohol. Facing total ruin, apple growers launched a desperate rebranding campaign. They dug up an obscure Welsh proverb from the 1860s and promoted it relentlessly: "An apple a day keeps the doctor away." They started breeding apples for sweetness and durability rather than fermentation. The image of the apple as a nutritional necessity took shape through this marketing blitz, a survival tactic used by growers to pivot away from a collapsed alcohol market. As the apple pivoted to a supermarket snack, growers focused heavily on aesthetics. When the Red Delicious variety was discovered in 1874, it was genuinely tasty, with yellow striped skin. But buyers liked red fruit, so industrial breeders selected generation after generation for a deeper, uniform crimson color and a thicker skin that could survive cross-country truck routes. This focus on color came with a biological cost. Because the genes controlling the apple's flavor compounds sat on the same chromosomes as the genes for the original yellow-striped skin, breeders inadvertently deactivated the taste of the apple in pursuit of a prettier product. The Red Delicious became the most popular apple in America, and its mealy, flavorless texture drove consumers away entirely. Sales collapsed so severely that in the year 2000, the federal government had to step in with a $138 million bailout to save struggling Red Delicious farmers. The industry needed a rescue, and they found it in a university lab. A researcher at the University of Minnesota planted a seedling designated MN1711, which produced a fruit with an explosively crisp texture that fractured cleanly when bitten. They patented it as the Honeycrisp. It revived small family orchards and generated over $10 million in royalties for the university. The Honeycrisp proved that consumers would pay a premium for taste over looks. Today, new varieties like the Sweet Tango are strictly managed club varieties, grown exclusively by licensed farmers. The wild fruit from the mountains of Kazakhstan is now a closely guarded, heavily licensed piece of intellectual property. Look at this grid. Each of these 17,000 distinct icons represents a named apple variety grown in the United States at the start of the 20th century. Every single one had its own unique flavor, texture, and resistance to disease. But when mass industrialization reached agriculture, diversity was sacrificed for efficiency. This extreme monoculture is highly dangerous because every commercial Gala or Fuji orchard on the planet is a clone army with the exact same DNA. They all share the exact same vulnerabilities. If a single evolved fungus or virus attacks one tree, it can spread unchecked through millions of genetically identical targets. These Central Asian forests contain more genetic variety than the entire global cultivated supply combined. This reservoir represents a vital biological backup, a library of resistant traits that have been stripped from commercial clones over centuries of industrial breeding. But during the Soviet era, those wild forests were heavily logged for timber and cleared for urban development. Researchers estimate that up to 80% of the wild apple forests in Central Asia have already been destroyed. We took a wild, resilient organism and cloned it to perfection for our shipping logistics and grocery store displays. But in our effort to completely control and brand the apple, we engineered away the exact genetic safety net required to keep it alive.